Hello. Hope everyone's okay. Thank you for joining this evening, and thank you for being extraordinarily patient whilst my computer had a little bit of a sleep. So today I'm going to be talking about the early history of British mycology. And I'm going to start with a bit of the contents about what we're going to start. I'm going to start first of all with a why. Why is it important to study the history of mycology? What is the point of it? And I think, yeah, why we want to do it. And then I'm going to talk about the origins of mycology in popular microscopy. And I'm going to trace how mycology emerged from this separate movement in microscopy. I'll then be doing something hopefully a bit of fun, looking at the conflicts and the founding of the British Mycological Society, before finishing on a how-to guide. So I'd like to start with some acknowledgements. What I'm going to say is somewhat subjective. It's also part of a much wider body of work on the history of British mycology. There's a large number of people who have written on it. They're all great. I've read all of them. I haven't read all of them. I keep finding new ones, but they're worth reading. They're really good. Actually, when this talk was announced, I had Ted Blackwell email me and say he's written on Henry Graves' bull, Fungalogist and the Father of Fungus Boy. I've got it here. It's really good. I really enjoyed it. It's so interesting. There's so much to do. This final part of the talk is going to be like how to get involved and how to do it. And I would encourage everyone to do so because it's really, really fun and it's really, really important. So let's move on to the why. And what I'd emphasize, if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. And I think that's a really important way to look at the history, really, so that the history is not just something that happened, it's something that's in many ways still happening now and it's going to continue to happen in the future. And I hope I don't insult anyone here, but mycology is an odd discipline. There's a lack of institutionalization. When I did my undergraduate, I studied in a department of plant sciences. When I did my PhD, I studied in a department of zoology. There are very few departments of mycology. There's a huge degree of independence. There's 40 plus groups in the UK alone. There's 40 associated with the BMS. There's a substantial number of others not associated, instead associated with the Fungal Conservation Trust, or indeed just true independence. And a huge amount of amateur engagement that is really one of the most exciting things about the discipline. Often mycology is grouped of disciplines, botany particularly, or microbiology, but none of these seem to fit, and this helps with the conflict. Something contemporary, which I'm really fascinated by at the moment, is this push towards the use of DNA typing. In many ways, it's a clash of traditions. I've taken here a couple of papers, the most recent one quite a conciliatory effort. But for those who are unaware, I'm sure that's very few of you, if any, there's been a push to allow DNA-only types for fungi, meaning that you can have a type without a physical specimen, you can have and only the sequence of DNA. And this is a very sensible thing in the world of microbiology, of bacteria, of viruses, of archaea. But it's a bit of an odd thing when you transplant it to the world of botany. Why would you accept a DNA-only type of a plant? You'd want to look at its floral structures. And mycology sits in the middle of that. Something that I think is particularly interesting. This is one of the response papers in the corner here to the initial proposal. And you can see that it's just there, the sheer number of authors. It's something that people feel deeply, it's something that people feel strongly. And for me, at least, it's something that is really heavily informed by this conflicting and differentiating history of mycology that comes from numerous places and brings numerous individuals from different discipline histories together. And it's important to study those histories so that hopefully we can reach good solutions. So let's have a look at the origins of British mycology. Now, traditionally, if you were to open a book, if you'd open Geoffrey Ainsworth's Introduction to the British Mycology, You'll see it linked to the Reverend Miles Joseph Berkeley, the founding father of British mycology. Obviously, for those aware of the history of natural history, there's Linnaeus, there's Banks, there's all these big names, but many of them are very uninterested in fungi. Indeed, I think there's a quote from Ramsbottom says Linnaeus, he set mycology back by the amount he ignored it. He took the fungi and he put them, or a large number of them at least, in this order called chaos, because it made no sense. And the traditional argument says that Miles Joseph Berkeley, beginning with his contribution to the English flora in 1836, he kind of birthed mycology. But does this explain this cultural difference we see between botany and mycology and other disciplines? So one for the chat, because I want to be a bit fun and interactive. What separates mycology from botany? And if anyone wants to put any answers in the chat, it'd be really wonderful. I said there's no wrong answers. There are no wrong answers. I've got one that I want to suggest. Spelling! Hey! Brilliant, Cameron. Let's give it a couple more seconds. Because I like interactive Zooms. I've been inspired by Ida from last week to challenge the conventions of the Zoom talk. Plants use photosynthesis. Sue says roots. Joanne says fungi more closely related to animals. Most plants can be seen most of the time. I like that. And what I would argue, I've been drawing. That's very, I've been drawing. Not sure that happened, but let's, not sure when that appears. Different kingdoms. Heterotrophic, reproduction, phenotypical. Yep, these are all great answers. They're all actually more correct than what I'm going to say, but what I'm going to say is microscopes. Microscopes really separate mycology and botany. A microscope for botany is nice, but non-essential. Annotate. Can we clear these? There we are. Sorry, it's going to annoy me otherwise. But microscopes really separate mycology and botany. You can do botany without a microscope. Thanks, Jen. Norma, could you please make sure you've got your annotations turned off? Yeah, microscopes. To do any microscopic identification, as everyone knows, you really need a microscope. You need to look at spores, you need to look at cystidia, you need to look at the spore-producing structures. Microscopes are essential to do good mycological taxonomy. They're not essential for plants. And that means if you've got a bad microscope, it makes mycology very difficult. Now, as a quick introduction to the history of microscopes, microscopes were, and I believe this is a technical term, quite naff up until about 1830. This is because the effects of the lenses caused not only blurry images, but quite distorted images. You can't make accurate measurements. If you can't make accurate measurements, you can't compare. This all changes in 1830 with the invention of the achromatic lens by Joseph Jackson Lister. For those interested in their mycological history, which I hope we all are, Joseph Jackson Lister had several children. One of them, of course, is the famous Lister responsible for aseptics and this history of surgery. The other one is, I believe it's Arthur Lister, who is responsible for a lot of our work on Myxomycetes, the slime molds, and it's his daughter, Gulielma Lister, who I'm sure many have heard of, and perhaps a few have had the lucky fortune to perhaps meet, who also did so much in Myxomycetes, the slime molds. But yeah, so in 1830, microscopes are good, but they're expensive. And this expensive nature means that they're kind of inaccessible. You can have a microscope if you're a doctor, you can have a microscope if you're an English gentleman or lady who wants to just have a nice, helpful recreation on the side, but you can't have them if you're part of the emerging middle classes. Slime molds aren't fungi, but they are traditionally studied by mycologists. So they're fungi of a lowercase f. the cost of microscopes actually reduced substantially in 1855. And what happened is William B. Carpenter, quite a prominent Victorian science educator, offered a prize. No, he said to School of Arts, let's offer a prize. Let's put this money out, make cheap microscopes. And it was two categories: cheap microscopes for individual use and cheap microscopes for schools. And this was done later that year. It was done by Field and Co. of Birmingham. And suddenly, in 1855, you have microscopes that are cheap and accessible for these emerging middle classes, these white collar workers. I believe this is phrased, these proud but poor. At the same time, we have Christian socialism. Now, this is founded as a third way. It kind of comes about in response to this charterist movement. And what it's looking to do is it wants to oppose this elitist, reactionary nature of the rich, but also wants to avoid this secular nature of this revolutionary poor. And it says, right, we want to mold the working class in the middle class image. There's lots of issues with that for many reasons, but it's based on this broad concept of the Christianizing of the socialist principle of cooperation. They're trying to encourage, it's wonderful. It focuses on this liberal education, and liberal education is for lack of a better word, education for education's sake. In the 1800s, we see this big push of the working class education, but a lot of it focuses on operative education. It says, I'm going to teach you maths so you can do your job better. I'm going to teach you to read so you can do your job better. I'm going to teach you working skills so you can be a better worker. But what liberal education does, says, I'm going to teach you Latin because Latin is fun to learn, and you can learn it and you can advance yourself in your education, and it's separated from the work. What's also interesting about this education in Christian socialism is that it evens out teachers and students. So the Christian socialists founded the Working Men's College in 1854, which you might notice is a very similar time to when the microscope became cheap. And part of the Working Men's College is that the teachers socialized with the students. They sang in the same choirs as the students. They went on expeditions with the students. It was supposed to be quite a fraternal, social atmosphere. And here, I think, is a fantastic time to introduce Mordecai Cubitt Cook. Pictured there with a microscope. I think it's very fitting. And there's a book, and I'm going to show you my copy because it's good to show copies of books. Here we are. Mordecai Cubitt Cook, Victorian naturalist, mycologist, teacher, and eccentric. It's a work done by one of his distant relatives. It's really, really good. It's very expansive, and if you want to know more about Cook, read that. But Cook really comes into mycology from a very weird way. He grows up in a radical Christian family. He becomes a school teacher, and in school teaching he advocates for science teaching, which was very controversial then. He advocates for teaching with objects, these quite modern pedagogical principles. And he falls into mycology because he's chatting to someone and they go, oh, these things taste really nice. And through that, he starts to explore more and he gets into mycology. And he's really important, I think, as an educator. Now, Cook has a large and complex family. If there's any criticism of Mary English's book, is that it kind of skims over what's quite unpleasant behavior in his private life, which I'm not going to talk more about. But because of this, he has a massive need to make money. He publishes a huge number of cheap books. Now, lots of these are really good. They've got Mildews, Rust and Smuts is fantastic. You've got a large number of great fungal books. Some of these are really awful. There's a book called Our Reptiles, famous for being really rubbish. But he's constantly producing these books that are accessible for people to buy. And as mentioned again, he was also a school teacher who advocated for science teaching. He's got this very big, he's one of the first people to get an exam in science teaching, actually. He's assessed by C.H. Huxley, amongst other people. And he teaches botany at the Working Men's College in 1861. And he's exposed to this principle. His brother, whose name eludes me, was a very big member of the Working Men's College, and such a key part of the history. If you read any history of the Working Men's Colleges, you'll come across a cook, and that is Mordecai's brother. But he teaches at the Working Men's College in 1861, hence very closely related to them. He leaves quite soon afterwards, and it's unsure why he left. We might speculate that it was something to do with his private life. We might speculate that it was something else, but he leaves. And he keeps in touch with his former students. He forms a society for amateur botanists, which is, again, it's a very radical society. We see a lot of quite famous future botanists, zoologists attend these meetings. And what is so radical about it is you have working class naturalists co-associating with middle and even middle upper class groups. And this continues for a while, and it eventually collapses. He also launched his Hardwicke's Science Gossip in 1865. Science Gossip is freely available online now. It's really worth a read. Again, it's a cheap and accessible journal. And what's fantastic and really quite radical about Hardwicke's Science Gossip is that anyone can write for it. They really emphasize that the tone of the journal is that, you know, a man chatting with his friend, I believe is the quote that Cook uses. And so you have an ability for working class naturalists to, working class and lower middle class naturalists to research and publish their research. And this is incredibly new and incredibly quite an attractive idea. And it's really popular. Science Gossip is a really popular journal. It goes on for a large number of years and even goes past Cook's ownership, I believe. It's a fantastic venture, and it's going to come across amazing. I'm going to mention that. But from these ventures, from Science Gossip, from the Society of Amateur Botanists, he went on to form the Qriket Microscopical Club. Now, hopefully, we've got some members here tonight because it's still going, and the Qriket Microscopical Club is wonderful. It's founded in 1865. The advert is done in Science Gossip. It's got a focus on education with a fantastically different memberships to the Royal Microscopical Society, formerly the Microscopical Society of London. This society attracted doctors, it attracted established university professors, you know, the great and good of society. In this society, it's cheaper to join. It's got a younger membership, it's got a poorer membership, it's got a lower class membership. And it brings them in, and it has a massive focus on training. It has training on identifying fungi within the first year. It has training on identifying bryophytes. Throughout, it has a substantial focus on cryptogams and fieldwork. Could women join? No. Oh, I'll just that later. I'll just at the end. It's quite, the answer is no. But it had this focus on cryptogams and fieldwork. It had a very different philosophy of practice. We think of a microscopical club, almost like trading slides and looking at this, but for the Qriket Club, fieldwork was as important as the actual microscopy. You know, members were encouraged to look at the fungi, they were encouraged to look at the bryophytes, they were encouraged to look at the algae, because this is where they could make discoveries and this is where they could have impact. And so this kind of grew up and it built up these communities interacting with each other. And then we're going to move north ever so slightly to the Yorkshire Grand period of mycology. This is defined by Elizabeth Blackwell in 1961. It's a really useful concept and useful framing. It represents a period from about 1880 to 1916. It's a group of primarily native Yorkshiremen who were very influential, accomplished independence. A little bit of a spoiler here, they separated from the British Mycological Society. But these members do a lot to really uplift this very quite Yorkshire mentality in many ways of quite rough, hardworking. It's all very stereotypical, but they institute a lot of this attitude in mycology about field work. They developed the foray as an educational prospect. It's really quite interesting. Here we are, and this is just a list of the Grand Period members. I'm sure many of you will recognise these names as authorities on certain taxa. Charles Crossland, George Massey, Cheeseman, Clark, Needham, Hebden, and Henry Thomas Soppitt, who was by far the youngest member and tragically also the first to die in 1899. These members came together after the end of the Wallop forays. The Yorkshire foray became dominant, and then in 1895, they came together to form the BMS. I'm going to quickly pause here. In the origins of the British Mycological Society, it's quite a contentious time. And we only have two narratives about this period of time. You have the narrative of John Ramsbottom, former keeper of the Natural History Museum. This is the narrative that is printed in Introduction to British Mycology by Geoffrey Ainsworth. It's the one that's reproduced a lot, and it's the dominant narrative. We also have Elizabeth Blackwell, who interviewed a large number of people and published some separate narratives in The Naturalist. Here we are, and here's the founders meeting of the British Mycological Society. We've got, in the corner here, we've got Alfred Clark, sometimes known as Massey's bulldog. He was the photographer. He spent a lot of did some really fantastic experimental work in photography, and was a chemist. We've got George Massey, who we're going to touch on more later. We've got the Reverend William Fowler, who was the first chair of the society. We've got the iron moulder James Needham. We've got Charles Crossland, the butcher, Mordecai Cook, very much the statesman, by cheeky style, and Carlton Weir. Carlton Weir being the one who's the most outside of this group. Most of them are Yorkshiremen, and Cook is very well known to everyone. This meeting occurred in Selby. Cook was deeply sympathetic to the Yorkshire mycologists. Massey was the first president, Crossan the first treasurer, and Weir the first secretary and editor of the society's transactions. And now the fun, well, I say it's all been fun, but now what I want to have a bit of a laugh with and a bit of play with is, I'm going to propose there was an academic assassination of George Edward Massey, 1845 to 1917. And by this, I mean that there was a concerted effort to kind of undo a lot of his legacy. Some can present some evidence. I've left some out, but I've presented as much as I can. Feel free to post comments and thoughts in the chat as you're going along. I can see it as it pops up. But we're going to move on from there. So the characters. We have George Massey. This slide is, I realise, out of date, and I'll explain why. Up until recently, Massey's date of birth was not known. He was born in 1845, but he published his date of birth as 1850 in most instances, and on at least one occasion as 1855. He had a very erratic early life. He was the first president of the BMS, second head of mycology at Kew, and the first who was permanently appointed. Mordecai Cook was the first head of mycology at Kew, but was employed on a contract basis, and the position was made permanent upon his retirement. And Massey took the role. He produced key microscopical and plant pathology texts, and he's globally recognised, or was globally recognised at the time. There's this quote which comes from Blackwell's Links with Past Yorkshire Mycology. I think is quite illustrative of this conception of Massey, at least at his peak. Every mycologist knows of Massey. Every mycological student has used one or other of his books. Indeed, to my student generation, Massey meant a book, not a human being. There was a red book, Massey's Diseases, and the 4 dark green volumes, Massey's Fungus Flora. And lucky we deemed the student who managed to buy the 1916 Massey British Fungi with a chapter on lichens with coloured plates. We've got Carlton Rea. He's the co-editor of the BMS Transactions, where he's initially the editor. He's the BMS secretary from its founding onwards, and he becomes the treasurer very shortly afterwards. According to one quote, I believe by Elsie Wakefield, he was the society. He's a very interesting man. He was a lawyer in Oxford, but never practiced. He played billiards more and spent way more time on mushrooms. Truly quite a good way to live. Finally, we've got John Ramsbottom. He's a personal friend and somewhat apprentice of Carlton Rea. He was the former keeper of the British Museum Herbarium. He's a self-appointed historian of British mycology, and he produces a huge number of texts. He writes a history of Scottish mycology. He writes a history of Essex mycology. He writes a substantial number of obituaries for many of mycology's first participants. He has a fantastic interest in Linnaeus. He becomes the co-editor of the BMS publications from 1919 to 1942, and is a general secretary from 1921 to 1945, slowly succeeding the roles that Carlton Rea held. So, to set the scene, what is British mycology like in 1900? I think I've shown you it's quite young still. It's really only had an institutional presence for about 10 years. It's very field focused. It's all about taxonomy. It's all about this very, it's touching on ecology just, but it's all about taxonomy. What's there? Where can we find it? What does it do? Many of its founders are still alive and active. Berkeley, I believe, is only just, Berkeley might still be alive. Cook is still alive, but he's slowly retiring, and it's no longer this authoritative presence. There's increasing professional recognition and training in mycology. What's notable about Cook is he has no university education, nor does Massey. But increasingly, people are able to have university educations in mycology. The Woolip Club forays, which Ramsbottom highlights as his founding point of mycology, they had ceased in 1892. And there's these two factions that claim succession. There's the British Mycological Society, and there's a slightly earlier Yorkshire Foray Committee, YMC, Yorkshire Mycological Committee. And they're heated up, and we have this union where the Yorkshire mycologists, they have this meeting in Selby, they invite Carlton Rea, and they form the BMS, and this kind of puts aside this factioning that's going on between North and South. And then there's this spark, and this spark is Massey versus Rea. And it's quite well published. Here we are, just to remind you again, we've got Carlton Rea sitting in the corner, and we've got George Massey, the furthest he can possibly be in the other corner. And in 1898, we have this. And I've copied this wholesale from John Ramsbottom's History of the Society. It's a fantastic paper he published, and it's certainly worth reading. He writes, a rift soon occurred. The 1898 foray was held in Dublin. Universal regret being expressed by all members that their president, Mr. George Massey, FLS, was unable to attend the meeting. The fact was that Massey and Rea had quarrelled. It is probable that Massey felt that as secretary, treasurer, and editor, Rea would have control of the society, and that his own influence would not be as great as he thought proper. Also, there was a clashing of temperaments, as so often on such occasions. It was the points of discrimination that looms large. Rea, somewhat of a dandy, Massey, a rough North countryman, both of rather violent temper, though their barks were usually more noticeable than their bites. Massey resigned from the society and was accompanied in a self-denying ordinance by several of his Yorkshire cronies. This is what is held in most histories of mycology as the true state of events. It's problematic for a number of reasons. The main one is that John Ramsbottom had a very close friendship with Carlton Rea. Carlton Rea, I had believed, just died at the point of this being published. There's an earlier account which doesn't even mention Rea at all. We can see a lot of stereotyping coming into play. Massey, a rough North countryman, which is interesting, as Elizabeth Blackwell describes him actually as a dandy. And then we have this fantastic sentence at the end, this self-denying ordinance by several of his Yorkshire cronies. And this causes a split. And it is a split that never really heals. It takes a lot of work by Pearson, particularly. And we have some forays that happen 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line between the two societies. And this is kind of the coming together. But it doesn't heal until Massey dies. Here's a slightly reduced version that's published in 1926 for William Norwood Cheeseman, one of the Yorkshire Grand Period members, obituary. Mr. Massey was elected first president and held the post for 2 years. Then, for some reason, he withdrew from the society with several of his Yorkshire friends, among whom was his great admirer, Mr. Cheeseman. What Massey failed to realise was the day of supreme authority had passed, even in systematic mycology, where he was willingly accorded that position in Yorkshire, continuing as chairman of the Mycological Committee until his death. So this is what is the official view. Having had a chance to look at some archives, it's quite interesting what pops up. But first of all, it's worth talking a little bit about Rea. This is also published in his History of Mycology, and it talks about Ramsbottom taking over from Rea, and he writes, "Meanwhile, there's a move to broaden the basis on which the society was run. As was to be expected, there had always been some criticisms of Rea's supreme position, but though autocratic, he was a most benevolent autocracy. Some members, grateful for the great services he had given to society, were anxious not to appear to be criticizing. Others were somewhat scared of his possible reaction." And it gets a little bit better. Here we are. This is one of my favorite letters that I've ever found. I'm going to read the text and I'm going to return to that letter. But there's a series of letters that happens between Frostons and Clark once Massey and the BMS separates, and they talk about shucking Carlton Rea to facilitate Massey's return. And they ask, Froston asks Clark to write to Massey for his opinion. Now, Massey's reply is lost. A lot of these letters are missing. But we do know that the reply is, yes, let's do it. Let's form a new society to challenge the BMS. And this doesn't happen. Instead, they focused on Yorkshire Club. And what we have here is a really, really beautiful letter. And it's sent from Mordecai Cubitt Cook to Alfred Clark. And it says, British Mycological Society, officer for 1909, Honourable President Carlton Rea, Honourable Secretary Carlton Rea, Honourable Treasurer Carlton Rea. Now, these are all true at this point. And it continues, Honourable Cashier Carlton Rea, Honourable Reporter Carlton Rea, Honourable Editor Carlton Rea, Honourable Autocrat Carlton Rea, Honourable Dictator Carlton Rea. What's some fantastic? Honourable Bill Licker, Honourable British Mycological Society, Universal Provider Carlton Rea is at the bottom. And what Clark has done at the bottom, he's written Honourable Solicitor, joining in on the joke. Carlton Rea is not a popular head of the Mycological Society, particularly amongst older members and northern members. And it wouldn't surprise you if more of these letters exist, but this one does. And it's quite beautiful and illustrative of Rea's position in the society. So let's look at the evidence for this academic assassination. I was told not to use that phrase, but I like it. It's a fun one. We've got this letter from Cook to Clark. He says, if I were 20 years younger, I should be pleased to enter into a fair fight with Carlton, but I'm not surprised to read between the lines that he is now aiming at getting himself recognised as a British authority on mycology and putting Massey in the shadow. He will never do it with people of sense. And what Cook is saying here is that actually Carlton Massey didn't jump, he was pushed. And he was pushed because Carlton wants to be the authority on British mycology. He wants to be a successor to Cook, a successor to Berkeley. He wants to be the person that people contact about mycology. We see later, and I'm not going to mention it much more here, but Ramsbottom, when he reviews Massey's books, is quite negative, particularly in his work on Mycetes. And it's quite illustrative that actually Carlton was working on a giant volume of British Mycetes. I've got it here, but I can't pick it up. And actually, it may have been for those reasons. Well, we have a motive here, at least, or suspected motive from Cook. We also have Amyria, or Amyria. I've not figured out which way it is supposed to be, and they swap around depending on which source. Who is Carlton Rear's wife, and one of the first, if not the first, female president of the society in 1914. Make of that what you will. She says in her presidential address, one of her first sentences is that I don't possess the mycological knowledge to be president. I'm not sure why you've elected me. This isn't to say that there weren't very exceptional British women mycologists. There were Annie Lorraine Smith, Juliana Lister, Elsie Wakefield. There's some fantastic people at the time, but Amyria becomes the first, or one of the first presidents. And in her address, which is focused on fungal illustrations, she writes that Mr. Massey is a competent draftsman and artist, I think we all admit, though his work is rather hard and mechanical. He has been a voluminous writer and has done very unequal work, and it's to be regretted that it was not more thorough. And this is interesting for several reasons. The first is that I would encourage anyone who's interested to read Notes on Fungus Illustrations. It's a really interesting presidential speech. Amyria was a fantastic artist, and she has fantastic insight into the artworks. However, as she confesses herself, she wasn't a great mycologist. And throughout this speech, every time she states a mycological opinion, she says, "My husband tells me that," and then gives the opinion. The only time she doesn't do that is in this sentence here, of saying he has been a voluminous writer and has done very unequal work. It's to be regretted that it was not more thorough, which is interesting. Additionally, Massey was a trained artist. He attended the York School of Art between 1862 and 1864. He won numerous prizes for his botanical illustrations, including the National Medal for Drawing of Plants of Nature. And this is truly a national medal where all of the art schools sent top students to exhibit in London. I believe in London, I'm not sure this one was, but to exhibit together. And Massey was awarded the National Medal for the Drawing of Plants from Nature. We can see one of his illustrations here. This is a very interesting one. I'm happy to talk about that later, but it's a very interesting illustration. And furthermore, she described Cook's illustrations of British fungi as by far the best series of paintings that have been published in Europe dealing exclusively with the Agaricaceae. Cook's illustrations of British fungi was largely illustrated by Massey, who is identifiable by, if you go through the book, any illustration that does not have a signature is an illustration done by Massey. All other artists sign their work. So it's an interesting claim. There's also contradictions that pop up. His experience with the younger school, who call themselves mycologists and yet profess the spy species, probably had much to do with his sharpness of tongue. So by John Ramsbottom in 1917. Whereas another time we have Massey cannot help thinking that botanists were too keen to make species and pay too little attention to matters that were of real scientific importance. As I'm happy to expand on later, Massey is a very contradictory person. So this isn't necessarily saying John Ramsbottom is being dishonest, but it's interesting what Ramsbottom chooses to focus on. Other motivations. There's an amateur versus professional element. Ramsbottom is a professional. He is university trained. Massey's eventual successor, L.C. Wakefield, is university trained and probably the finest mycologist of the 20th century. Massey is increasingly an odd one out. He occupies arguably the top position in mycology in the UK, this curator of the mycological collections at Kew, and he is an amateur by all intents and purposes. So there's an amateur versus professional element. There's also this conflict that's constantly going on. So not only is Ramsbottom potentially defending Howto and Amyria as a friend, but Ramsbottom as a society man, he very much was a society man. Be very aware of the conflict between the BMS and the YNU. And here we can see the membership of the BMS published. And the numbers towards the end are a little bit off for certain reasons, but you can see here, it's quite shallow, it stops. And we can also see it's stayed the same. When he wrote his history of mycology, it stayed the same for about 20 years. Membership hasn't been increasing. In fact, we've even got a slight dip that's just happened here. So he's writing at periods where membership is stagnating. There's this idea of taxonomic mycology versus plant pathology. And what is mycology if not of arguments between different factions? Massey was one of the first adopters of plant pathology. He was really quite innovative in his methods. His Diseases of Cultivated Plants, I believe is the title. It's an exceptional work. He taught plant pathology to the Gardens at Kew. He really loved plant pathology. Ramsbottom did not, and was a massive believer that plant pathology wasn't true mycology. And finally, there's Massey's personal impression. He had a sharp tongue. On numerous instances, it's reported that Massey let loose at groups that fell beneath his standards. This includes the still extant Essex Field Club, who he claimed weren't serious about their study of fungi, and a substantial rant that the editor felt the need to reply to, which is quite a rare occurrence. There's also his infamous speech at the Kew Guild, which, if anyone ever has a transaction of, I would love to read. But the report talks how Massey went through each group at Kew in turn and effectively told them how to do their job better. He had a go at the botanists. He had a go at the horticulturalists. He went around everyone. And its arguments this was done for pedagogical benefit to improve people. There's people who are mixed on it, but certainly it did draw some people the wrong way. He lied about his education. If you read any obituary on Massey, or most obituaries on Massey, they'll mention his Cambridge education. Massey never went to Cambridge. I've checked the records of all matriculations, both at college and at the university. There is no record of Massey at the university at all. He also lied about his age repeatedly. Massey was an odd figure. He also claimed to have served in the French Foreign Legion. I imagine it's a lie, but I can't prove it because I can't access the French Foreign Legion records. So he had quite a lot of controversial claims. And what is all the result of all of this talking about Massey? Well, Roy Watling, whose work is exquisite, describes Massey, this huge authoritative figure in mycology, as a Yorkshireman who drifted into mycology from farming, arts college, and agricultural work abroad. It dampens Massey's input and emphasizes this almost accidental wandering that denies agency to Massey's work and to his motivations. So that's there. Finally, I'd like to have a quick chat on Howto Guides. Hopefully you've enjoyed what I've been talking about today. It's been a bit rambly. Maybe you thought, oh, that sounds really easy. I could do that. I guarantee you, you can, and I would encourage you to. I fell into the history of mycology in a period where I had a lack of access to funding and I needed to produce work. It's a piece of I have no training as a historian. I received about 3 months formal training as a historian at the end of my PhD. But I fell into it, and I was really glad to have a number of historians be very helpful and lovely to me, particularly Nick Jardine, Helen Ann Curry, and Anne Secord, who took time to read my work and really give some good feedback on what were some quite awful first drafts. But it's really accessible, it's really easy, and it's really cheap, and I'd encourage everyone to get involved. So I'm just going to quickly point out resources. Cybertruffle.org and CyberLiber is an archive of a lot of fungal texts. It's really worth accessing. Biodiversitylibrary.org is amazing. It has all of the naturalists on it, which is the YNU's publication. It has all of science gossip. It has any publication you really want to find is on there, and they're searchable, which means that you don't need to claw through reading, going through indexes. You can search the phrase you want and it will take you to that page. There are local museums, libraries and record centres. I've spent a substantial amount of time going around museums, libraries and record centres. There's a lot of stuff there that people haven't touched. There's a lot of fungal records. There's a lot of fungaria and dried fungal specimens that no one has looked at. My favourite letter about Carlson-Rear has never been published about until recently. It hasn't been seen, it hasn't been reported on. It's a key aspect of understanding British mycology which hasn't been seen. You can find them in local museums, libraries and record centres. They're desperate for volunteers. It's a great way to get in. Finally, there's brief biographies of British mycologists. Oh, it is the best book in the world. I've got one copy, and I've got 2 copies. That's how much I like it. It's really, really good. It's really amazing. It was compiled by Geoffrey Ainsworth, and it is little small descriptions of mycologists, what they did, what their contribution was. It will give you links to further publications about them, so you can find out more information. And it's also really good to find stories. I fell into the history of mycology because I was reading brief biographies, and I read Masseys, and it seemed a bit off. It didn't seem like it made sense. And that was 4 or 5 years ago now, and it's been a really productive line of inquiry. So I'd encourage everyone to get involved. Emma, I can see, has linked it on Amazon, and I would encourage you all to buy a copy. However, if you Google brief biographies of British mycologists, you can find a free PDF online. I'm not sure how legal that is, but you can find it. It's really good. I've got copies saved on every computer I own. It's a really good thing to have. But you can Google it and you can find it online. And if you can't find it, send me an email and I will send you a copy. But it's a really good starting place. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say thank you ever so much for listening to me ramble about stuff that I really love. And I'm going to ask if there are any questions. If you have answers, Fungal Book Club. If you're going to read any book, read this. Read the Cook one. It's amazing. It's really well researched. There's excerpts of letters published there. Some of those letters are now missing and can't be found anymore, so there are only copies of them are here. This would be really worth reading. What else have we got? We've got Harry Marshall Ward and the Fungal Thread of Death. It's very American, but it's about Harry Marshall Ward. He was a professor at Cambridge and another one of these big mycological pioneers. So this is that one there. I don't think it's as good as the cookbook, but they're both really quite great. Jane asked, could women join the Qriket club? They can now. Cook had many flaws. Yeah, I'm Emma. If you please, could you put those book titles into the chat? If not, Cam, if you want to hang around at the end, or I'll send you an email for those book titles. But yeah, women can join the Qriket Club now. Cook had many flaws. One of his flaws is that he didn't want to have women in the society, and he made several quite prominent speeches that I believe you can find transcripts for, or at least reports about, against women joining the Qriket Club. And I believe he was successful the first time and unsuccessful the second, but I'm not sure. But again, anything about Cook, it's worth reading this, and it certainly provokes discussion.
Nathan, could you just tell me the title again of that book? Sorry. Is it the one that's already in the chat?
Yes, it's the one that's already in the chat.
So could you read the title out?
Mordecai Cubitt Cook, Victorian naturalist, mycologist, teacher, and eccentric. There's also, it's a bit shorter, there's Harry Marshall Ward and the Fungal Thread of Death. And the title for that comes from Harry Marshall Ward was diabetic, or at least believed to be diabetic. So he died very young as well. But because it's a fun story, he is responsible. He adopted this new botany, this really botany focused on microscopes and physiology, and was responsible for designing the Cambridge Botany School for anyone who lives in Cambridge. So the Cambridge Botany School was, or was at the time, a very modern lab, and it was built and designed to Harry Marshall Ward's specifications. So it's interesting. His grave is in Cambridge. You can find his grave as well. But it's quite a sad story. Jane, that's fantastically related to William Millward Cheeseman. I would love to talk further. And I'm going to put my email in the chat to everyone, but Jane in particular, please send me an email so we can chat afterwards.
Nathan, there's a question a bit further up, or a comment from Marika Parslow, a bit further up there in the chat, just above Jane's comment.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's way more mycological history before Berkeley. John Ray did a little bit. Yeah, there's some really there was a lot going on before Berkeley, and I was a bit flippant. There is, I always forget the name now. I'm gonna stop sharing so I can pull up the name. Oh, that's on PowerPoint.
While Nathan's doing that, just,
we have
just a note that I have put a couple of books in the chat. So the Fungal Thread of Death, that's in the chat, and also the book Mordecai Cubitt Cook, that's also
fantastic.
in there as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of mycology done before Cook. One that's particularly interesting is James Bolton, who very little is known about, but pops up out of Yorkshire and publishes one of the first big books on fungi. I think what I would like to emphasize is that before Berkeley, or before Cook even, most mycologists worked alone. They were individuals, either as eccentric botanists who had delved into mycology a little bit, but they didn't see themselves as mycologists. The term didn't exist. They saw themselves as botanists, and they generally worked alone without this community feel. And what we see in the 18th century, in the 19th century is this growth of these societies and this mycology as an identity. But thank you, Mariko, for reminding that. Yeah, no, mycology didn't pop up. Then there's a lot of stuff done before it. Mariko's given a lot of really good names, and I'd add to that John Bolton, who is actually worth reading about. Have I missed any questions? Yeah, any questions on anything at all, really?
Yeah, I think that's possibly it, Nathan. So thank you everybody for attending this evening's talk. It's good to see everyone here again. I'm just going to remind everyone, if you didn't catch all of tonight's talk, or if you want to listen again, we have been recording it, so we'll be making that available once it's edited down by by Nathan himself. So we'll be making sure that's available. And if you're interested in finding out what other talks have been happening over the past few months, there's some information on the British Mycological Society website, and I've just posted a link to all of our talks that can be found via the website in the chat there. So if you've missed some of our past talks, please have a look at those as well. Thanks again. Thank you very much, Nathan. That was brilliant. A really interesting insight into some very controversial history. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone. Hopefully we'll see you another time. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.